Alright, today we'll be doing another little practice game. We'll be doing Ethiopians, I'll be Ethiopians against the AI Malians, and we'll be doing a full random chaos theory here. The map will be pretty large, high resources, and let's start. So today, our audiobook that we'll be listening to is called Misbehaving, about behavioral economics. So let's start listening to that right now.
Chapter 3. The List.
Okay, let's make our scout.
The discrepancy between buying and selling prices got my mind wandering. What else do people do that is inconsistent with the economist's model of rational choice?
Again, you want your
Once I started paying
really
attention, so many examples cropped up that I started a list on the blackboard in my office.
So
Here are a few that describe the behavior of some of my friends. Jeffrey and I somehow get 2 free tickets to a professional basketball game in Buffalo. Normally an hour-and-a-half drive from where we live in Rochester. The day of the game, there's a big snowstorm. We decide not to go. But Jeffrey remarks that had we bought the expensive tickets, we would have braved the blizzard and attempted to drive to the game. Stanley mows his lawn every weekend, and it gives him terrible hay fever. I ask Stan why he doesn't hire a kid to mow his lawn. Stan says he doesn't want to pay the $10. I ask Stan whether he would mow his neighbor's lawn for $20, and Stan says no, of course not.
Of course, all in...
Linnea is shopping for a clock radio. She finds a model she likes at what her research has suggested is a good price, $45. As she is about to buy it, the clerk at the store mentions that the same radio is on sale for $35 at a new branch of the store, 10 minutes away, that is holding a grand opening sale. Does she drive to the other store to make the purchase?
Would you drive to the other store?
On a separate shopping trip, Linnea is shopping for a television set and finds one at the good price of $495.
And
again, the clerk informs her that the same model is on sale at another store 10 minutes away for $485. Same question, but likely different answer. Lee's wife gives him an expensive cashmere sweater for Christmas.
But
he had seen the sweater in the store and decided that it was too big of an indulgence to feel good about buying it. He is nevertheless delighted with the gift. Lee and his wife pool all their financial assets. Neither has any separate source of money. Some friends come over for dinner. We're having drinks and waiting for something roasting in the oven to be finished so we can sit down to eat. I bring out a large bowl of cashew nuts for us to nibble on. We eat half the bowl in 5 minutes, and our appetite is in danger. I remove the bowl and hide it in the kitchen. Everyone is happy.
Richard Thaler.
Each example illustrates a behavior that is inconsistent with economic theory. Jeffrey is ignoring the economist's dictum to ignore sunk costs, meaning money that has already been spent. The price we paid for the tickets should not affect our choice about whether to go to the game. Stanley is violating the precept that buying and selling prices should be about the same. If Linnea spends 10 minutes to save $10 on a small purchase, but not on a large one, she is not valuing time consistently. Lee feels better about spending family resources on an expensive sweater if his wife made the decision, though the sweater was no cheaper. And removing the cashews takes away the option to eat some more. To econs, more choices are always preferred to fewer.
What he means by econs is he described
I spent a fair amount of time staring at the list and adding new items, but I did not know what to do with it.
And
Dumb stuff people do is not a satisfactory title for an academic paper. Then I got a break. In the summer of 1976, Sherwin and I went to a conference near Monterey, California. We were there to talk about the value of a life. What made the conference special for me were 2 psychologists who attended, Baruch Fischoff and Paul Slovic. They both studied how people make decisions. It was like discovering a new species. I had never met anyone in academia with their backgrounds. I ended up giving Fischoff a ride to the airport. As we drove, Fischoff told me he had completed a PhD in psychology at the Hebrew University in Israel. There he had worked with two guys whose names I had never heard, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Baruch told me about his now famous thesis on hindsight bias. The finding is that, after the fact, we think that we always knew the outcome was likely, if not a foregone conclusion. After the virtually unknown African-American Senator Barack Obama defeated the heavily favored Hillary Clinton for the Democratic Party presidential nomination, many people thought they had seen it coming. They hadn't. They were just misremembering. I found the concept of hindsight bias fascinating and incredibly important to management. One of the toughest problems a CEO faces is convincing managers that they should take on risky projects if the expected gains are high enough. Their managers worry, for good reason, that if the project works out badly, the manager who championed the project will be blamed, whether or not the decision was a good one at the time.
Right.
Hindsight bias greatly exacerbates this problem, because the CEO will wrongly think that whatever was the cause of the failure, it should have been anticipated in advance.
Nope.
And with the benefit of hindsight, he always knew this project was a poor risk. What makes the bias particularly pernicious is that we all recognize this bias in others, but not in ourselves.
Yep.
Baruch suggested that I might enjoy reading some of the work of his advisors. The next day, when I was back in my office in Rochester, I headed over to the library. Having spent all my time in the economics section, I found myself in a new part of the library. I started with the duo's summary paper published in Science, Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. At the time, I was not sure what a heuristic was, but it turns out to be a fancy word for a rule of thumb. As I read, my heart started pounding the way it might during the final minutes of a close game. The paper took me 30 minutes to read from start to finish, but my life had changed forever.
Let's get some guards going on.
The thesis of the paper was simple and elegant. Humans have limited time and brain power. As a result, they use simple rules of thumb, heuristics, to help them make judgments. An example would be availability. Suppose I ask you if Dhruva is a common name. If you are from most countries in the world, you would likely say no. But it happens to be a very common name in India, a country with a lot of people. So on a global scale, it is in fact a rather common name. In guessing how frequent something is, we tend to ask ourselves how often we can think of instances of that type. It's a fine rule of thumb, and in the community in which you live, the ease with which you can recall meeting people with a given name will offer a good clue as to its actual frequency. But the rule will fail in cases in which the number of instances of some event is not highly correlated with the ease with which you can summon up examples, such as the name Dhruva. This is an illustration of the big idea of this article, one that made my hands shake as I read.
Now that we know our strengths and weaknesses.
Using these heuristics causes people to make predictable errors. Thus, the title of the paper, Heuristics and Biases. The concept of predictable biases offered a framework for my heretofore helter-skelter set of ideas. A forerunner of Kahneman and Tversky was Herbert Simon, a polymath academic who spent most of his career at Carnegie Mellon University. Simon was well known in nearly every field of social science, including economics, political science, artificial intelligence, and organizational theory. But most germane to this book, he wrote about what he called bounded rationality, well before Kahneman and Tversky came along.
Check out Adam,
in saying that people have bounded rationality, Simon meant that they lack the cognitive ability to solve complex problems, which is obviously true. Yet, although he received a Nobel Prize in economics, unfortunately, I think it is fair to say that he had little impact on the economics profession. The Economics Prize is not one of the original Nobel Prizes laid out in Alfred Nobel's will, though it is awarded alongside them. Its full name is Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences, in memory of Alfred Nobel. But here I'll just call it the Nobel Prize for short. I believe many economists ignored Simon because it was too easy to brush aside bounded rationality as a true but unimportant concept. Economists were fine with the idea that their models were imprecise, and that the predictions of those models would contain error. In the statistical models used by economists, this is handled simply by adding what is called an error term to the equation. Suppose you try to predict the height that a child will reach at adulthood, using the height of both parents as predictors. This model will do a decent job since tall parents tend to have tall children, but the model will not be perfectly accurate, which is what the error term is meant to capture. And as long as the errors are random, that is, the model's predictions are too high or too low with equal frequency, then all is well. The errors cancel each other out. This was economists' reasoning to justify why the errors produced by bounded rationality could safely be ignored. Back to the fully rational model. Kahneman and Tversky were waving a big red flag that said these errors were not random. Ask people whether there are more gun deaths caused by homicide or suicide in the U.S., and most will guess homicide. But in fact, there are almost twice as many gun deaths by suicide than homicides. In fact, just having a gun in the house increases the risk that a member of the household will commit suicide.
I mean, clearly.
This is a predictable error. Even across many people, the errors will not average out to zero. Although I did not appreciate it fully at the time, Kahneman and Tversky's insights had inched me forward so that I was just one step away from doing something serious with my list. Each of the items on the list was an example of a systematic bias. The items on the list had another noteworthy feature. In every case, economic theory had a highly specific prediction about some key factor, such as the presence of the cashews or the amount paid for the basketball game tickets, that the theory said should not influence decisions. They were all supposedly irrelevant factors, or SIFs. Much subsequent work in behavioral economics has been to show which SIFs are in fact highly relevant in predicting behavior, often by taking advantage of the systematic biases suggested in Tversky and Kahneman's 1974 paper. In case you are wondering about the order of the names in their papers, early on, Amos and Danny adopted the highly unusual strategy of alternating whose name would go first, as a subtle way of signaling that they were equal partners. In economics, alphabetical order is the default option. But in psychology, the order of names usually is meant to indicate relative contributions.
Nope, that's how it is.
Their solution avoided having to make a decision, paper by paper, about who had contributed more. Such evaluations can be fraught. See Chapter 28. By now, it's a long list, far surpassing what was written on my blackboard all those years ago. I spent an exciting few hours reading everything Kahneman and Tversky had written together, and left the library with my head spinning. Chapter 4. Value Theory. After my day in the library, I called Fishoff to thank him. He told me that Kahneman and Tversky were working on a new project about decision-making that should be right up my alley. Fishoff thought that Howard Kunruther, a professor at Wharton, might have a copy. I called Howard and struck gold. He had the draft and would send me a copy. The paper, called Value Theory at the time, arrived replete with Howard's comments scrawled in the margins. It was an early version of the paper that would win Danny a Nobel Prize in 2002. Amos would have shared the prize had he been alive. In time, the authors changed the title to Prospect Theory. I asked Danny why they changed the name. His reply? Value theory was misleading, and we decided to have a completely meaningless term, which would become meaningful if by some lucky break the theory became important. Prospect fitted the bill.
Going too fast.
This paper was even more germane to the list than the work on heuristics and biases. Two things grabbed me immediately: an organizing principle and a simple graph. Two kinds of theories. The organizing principle was the existence of two different kinds of theories, normative and descriptive. Normative theories tell you the right way to think about some problem. By right, I do not mean right in some moral sense. Instead, I mean logically consistent, as prescribed by the optimizing model at the heart of economic reasoning, sometimes called rational choice theory. That is the only way I will use the word normative in this book. For instance, the Pythagorean theorem is a normative theory of how to calculate the length of one side of a right triangle if you know the length of the other two sides. If you use any other formula, you will be wrong. Here is a test to see if you are a good intuitive Pythagorean thinker. Consider two pieces of railroad track, each 1 mile long, laid end to end. See the accompanying PDF. The tracks are nailed down at their end points, but simply meet in the middle. Now, suppose it gets hot and the railroad tracks expand, each by 1 inch. Since they are attached to the ground at the end points, the tracks can only expand by rising like a drawbridge. Furthermore, these pieces of track are so sturdy that they retain their straight linear shape as they go up. This is to make the problem easier, so stop complaining about unrealistic assumptions. Here is your problem. Consider just one side of the track. We have a right triangle with a base of 1 mile, a hypotenuse of 1 mile plus 1 inch. What is the altitude? In other words, by how much does the track rise above the ground? If you remember your high school geometry, have a calculator with a square root function handy, and know that there are 5,280 feet in a mile and 12 inches in a foot, you can solve this problem. But suppose instead you have to use your intuition. What is your guess? Most people figure that since the tracks expanded by an inch, they should go up by roughly the same amount, or maybe as much as 2 or 3 inches. The actual answer is 29.6 feet. How did you do? Now, suppose we want to develop a theory of how people answer this question. If we are rational choice theorists, we assume that people will give the right answer. So we will use the Pythagorean theorem as both our normative and descriptive model, and predict that people will come up with something near 30 feet. For this problem, that is a terrible prediction. The average answer that people give is about 2 inches. This gets to the heart of the problem with traditional economics and the conceptual breakthrough offered by prospect theory. Economic theory at that time, and for most economists today, uses one theory to serve both normative and descriptive purposes. Consider the economic theory of the firm. This theory, a simple example of the use of optimization-based models, stipulates that firms will act to maximize profits, or the value of the firm, and further elaborations on the theory simply spell out how that should be done. For example, a firm should set prices so that marginal cost equals marginal revenue. When economists use the term marginal, it just means incremental. So this rule implies that the firm will keep producing until the point where the cost of the last item made is exactly equal to the incremental revenue brought in. Similarly, the theory of human capital formation, pioneered by the economist Gary Becker, assumes that people choose which kind of education to obtain and how much time and money to invest in acquiring these skills by correctly forecasting how much money they will make and how much fun they will have in their subsequent careers. There are very few high school and college students whose choices reflect careful analysis of these factors. Instead, many people study the subject they enjoy most without thinking through to what kind of life that will create. Prospect theory sought to break from the traditional idea that a single theory of human behavior can be both normative and descriptive. Specifically, the paper took on the theory of decision-making under uncertainty. The initial ideas behind this theory go back to Daniele Bernoulli in 1738. Bernoulli was a student of almost everything, including mathematics and physics, and his work in this domain was to solve a puzzle known as the St. Petersburg paradox, a puzzle posed by his cousin, Nicholas. The puzzle is this. Suppose you are offered a gamble where you keep flipping a coin until it lands heads up. If you get heads on your first flip, you win $2. On your second flip, $4. and so forth, with the pot doubling each time. Your expected winnings are 1/2 times $2, plus 1/4 times $4, plus 1/8 times $8. The value of this sequence is infinite. So why won't people pay a huge amount to play the bet? Bernoulli's answer was to suppose that people get diminishing value from increases in their wealth, which yields risk aversion. A simpler solution is to note that there is only a finite amount of wealth in the world, so you should be worried about whether the other side can pay up if you win. Just 40 heads in a row puts your prize money at over $1 trillion. If you think that would break the bank, the bet is worth more than $40. They came from a precocious family. Essentially, Bernoulli invented the idea of risk aversion. He did so by positing that people's happiness, or utility, as economists like to call it, increases as they get wealthier, but at a decreasing rate. This principle is called diminishing sensitivity. As wealth grows, the impact of a given increment of wealth, say $10,000, falls. To a peasant, a $10,000 windfall would be life-changing. To Bill Gates, it would go undetected. A graph of what this looks like appears in the accompanying PDF. A utility function of this shape implies risk aversion because the utility of the first $1,000 is far greater than the utility of the second $1,000, and so forth. This implies that if your wealth is $100,000, and I offer you a choice between an additional $1,000 for sure or a 50% chance to win $2,000, you will take the sure thing because you value the second 1,000 you would win less than the first 1,000. So you are not willing to risk losing that first $1,000 prize in an attempt to get $2,000. The full treatment of the formal theory of how to make decisions in risky situations, called expected utility theory, was published in 1944 by the mathematician John von Neumann and the economist Oskar Morgenstern. John von Neumann, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, was a contemporary of Albert Einstein at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton University, and during World War II he decided to devote himself to practical problems. The result was the 600-plus page opus, The Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, in which the development of expected utility theory was just a sideline. The way that von Neumann and Morgenstern created the theory was to begin by writing down a series of axioms of rational choice. They then derived how someone who wanted to follow these axioms would behave. The axioms are mostly uncontroversial notions such as transitivity, a technical term that says if you prefer A over B and B over C, then you must prefer A over C. Remarkably, von Neumann and Morgenstern proved that if you want to satisfy these axioms, and you do, then you must make decisions according to their theory. The argument is completely convincing. If I had an important decision to make, whether to refinance my mortgage or invest in a new business, I would aim to make the decision in accordance with expected utility theory, just as I would use the Pythagorean theorem to estimate the altitude of our railroad triangle. Expected utility is the right way to make decisions. With prospect theory, Kahneman and Tversky set out to offer an alternative to expected utility theory that had no pretense of being a useful guide to rational choice. Instead, it would be a good prediction of the actual choices real people make. It is a theory about the behavior of humans. Although this seems like a logical step to take, it is not one that economists had ever really embraced. Simon had coined the term bounded rationality, but had not done much fleshing out of how boundedly rational people differ from fully rational ones. There were a few other precedents, but they too had never taken hold. For example, the prominent, and for the most part quite traditional, Princeton economist William Baumol had proposed an alternative to the traditional, normative theory of the firm, which assumes profit maximization. He postulated that firms maximize their size, measured for instance by sales revenue, subject to a constraint that profits have to meet some minimum level. I think sales maximization may be a good descriptive model of many firms. In fact, it might be smart for a CEO to follow this strategy, since CEO pay oddly seems to depend as much on a firm's size as it does on its profits. But if so, that would also constitute a violation of the theory that firms maximize value. The first thing I took from my early glimpse of prospect theory was a mission statement. Build descriptive economic models that accurately portray human behavior. A stunning graph. The other major takeaway for me was a figure depicting the value function. This too was a major conceptual change in economic thinking, and the real engine of the new theory. Ever since Bernoulli, economic models were based on a simple assumption that people have diminishing marginal utility of wealth, as illustrated in Figure 2. See the accompanying PDF. This model of the utility of wealth gets the basic psychology of wealth right. But to create a better descriptive model, Kahneman and Tversky recognized that we had to change our focus from levels of wealth to changes in wealth. This may sound like a subtle tweak, but switching the focus to changes as opposed to levels is a radical move. A picture of their value function is shown further below in Figure 3. See the accompanying PDF. Kahneman and Tversky focus on changes because changes are the way humans experience life. Suppose you are in an office building with a well-functioning air circulation system that keeps the environment at what we typically think of as room temperature. Now you leave your office to attend a meeting in a conference room. As you enter the room, how will you react to the temperature? If it is the same as that of your office and the corridor, you won't give it a second thought. You will only notice if the room is unusually hot or cold relative to the rest of the building. When we have adapted to our environment, we tend to ignore it. The same is true in financial matters. Consider Jane, who makes $80,000 per year. She gets a $5,000 year-end bonus that she had not expected. How does Jane process this event? Does she calculate the change in her lifetime wealth, which is barely noticeable? No, she is more likely to think, wow, an extra $5,000. People think about life in terms of changes, not levels. They can be changes from the status quo or changes from what was expected. But whatever form they take, it is changes that make us happy or miserable. That was a big idea. The figure in the paper so captured my imagination that I drew a version of it on the blackboard right next to the list. Have another look at it now. There is an enormous amount of wisdom about human nature captured in that S-shaped curve. The upper portion, for gains, has the same shape as the usual utility of wealth function, capturing the idea of diminishing sensitivity. But notice that the loss function captures diminishing sensitivity also. The difference between losing $10 and $20 feels much bigger than the difference between losing $1,300 and $1,310. This is different from the standard model, because starting from a given wealth level in Figure 1, losses are captured by moving down the utility of wealth line, meaning that each loss gets increasingly painful. If you care less and less about increases in wealth, then it follows that you care more and more about decreases in wealth. The fact that we experience diminishing sensitivity to changes away from the status quo captures another basic human trait. One of the earliest findings in psychology, known as the Weber-Fechner law. The Weber-Fechner law holds that the just noticeable difference in any variable is proportional to the magnitude of that variable. If I gain 1 ounce, I don't notice it. But if I am buying fresh herbs, the difference between 2 ounces and 3 ounces is obvious. Psychologists refer to a just noticeable difference as a JND. If you want to impress an academic psychologist, add that term to your cocktail party banter.
Nope.
I went for the more expensive sound system in the new car I bought because the increase in price was not a JND.
You can test your understanding of the concept behind the Weber-Fechner law with this example from National Public Radio's long-running show called Car Talk. The The show consisted of brothers Tom and Ray Maliozzi, both MIT graduates, taking calls from people with questions about their cars. Improbably enough, it was hysterically funny, especially to them. They would laugh endlessly at their own jokes. Tom Maliozzi passed away in 2014, but the show lives on in reruns, where the two brothers are still laughing. In one show, a caller asked, "Both my headlights went out at the same time. I took the car to the shop, but the mechanic said that all I needed was 2 new bulbs. How can that be right? Isn't it too big of a coincidence that both bulbs blew out at the same time?" Tom answered the question in a flash. "Ah, the famous Weber-Fechner law." It turns out that Tom also did a PhD in psychology and marketing supervised by Max Bazerman, a leading scholar in judgment and decision-making research. So, what does the caller's question have to do with the Weber-Fechner law? And how did this insight help Tom solve the problem? The answer is that the 2 bulbs did not, in fact, burn out at the same time. It is easy to drive around with 1 bulb burned out and not notice, especially if you live in a well-lit city. Going from 2 bulbs to 1 is not always a noticeable difference. But going from 1 to 0 is definitely noticeable.
Peter Thiel.
This phenomenon also
That's
explains the
another good
behavior
thing. I
in
highly
one of the
recommend.
examples on the list. Being more willing to drive 10 minutes to save $10 on a $45 clock radio than on a $495 television set. For the latter purchase, the savings would not be a JND. The fact that people have diminishing sensitivity to both gains and losses has another implication. People will be risk-averse for gains, but risk-seeking for losses, as illustrated by the experiment reported below, which was administered to 2 different groups of subjects. Notice that the initial sentence in the 2 questions differs in a way that makes the 2 problems identical if subjects are making decisions based on levels of wealth, as was traditionally assumed. The percentage of subjects choosing each option is shown in brackets. Problem 1. Assume yourself richer by $300 than you are today. You are offered a choice between A, a sure gain of $100, 72%, or B, a 50% chance to gain $200 and a 50% chance to lose $0, 28%. Problem 2. Assume yourself richer by $500 than you are today. You are offered a choice between A, a sure loss of $100, 36%, or B, a 50% chance to lose $200 and a 50% chance to lose $0, 64%. The reason why people are risk-seeking for losses is the same logic that applies to why they are risk-averse for gains. In the case of problem 2, the pain of losing the second $100 is less than the pain of losing the first 100. So, subjects are ready to take the risk of losing more in order to have the chance of getting back to no loss at all. They are especially keen to eliminate a loss altogether because of the third feature captured in Figure 3, loss aversion. Examine the value function in this figure at the origin, where both curves begin. Notice that the loss function is steeper than the gain function. It decreases more quickly than the gain function goes up. Roughly speaking, losses hurt about twice as much as gains make you feel good. This feature of the value function left me flabbergasted. There, in that picture, was the endowment effect. If I take away Professor Rossit's bottle of wine, he will feel it as a loss equivalent to twice the gain he would feel if he acquired a bottle. That is why he would never buy a bottle worth the same market price as one in his cellar. The fact that a loss hurts more than an equivalent gain gives pleasure is called loss aversion. It has become the single most powerful tool in the behavioral economist's arsenal. So, we experience life in terms of changes. We feel diminishing sensitivity to both gains and losses sting more than equivalently sized gains feel good. That is a lot of wisdom in one image. Little did I know that I would be playing around with that graph for the rest of my career. Chapter 5. California Dreamin'. Sherwin Rosen was planning to spend the summer of 1977 at Stanford and invited me to join him out west to do some more work on the value of a life. At some point that spring, I learned that Kahneman and Tversky were planning to spend the academic year at Stanford. After all the inspiration their work had provided me, I could not bear the thought of leaving town just before they arrived in September. Over spring break, I flew to California to investigate housing for the summer, and at the same time try to finagle a way to stay around Stanford during the fall semester. I hoped I might get to spend some time with the complete strangers who had become my new idols. I had sent Tversky an early draft of my first behavioral paper, which at the time carried the title Consumer Choice, a Theory of Economists' Behavior, with the implicit suggestion that only economists behave like econs. He had sent a short but friendly reply saying we were clearly thinking along similar lines. But that was it. In the days before email, it was much more difficult to initiate a long-distance conversation. I spent a few days begging and pleading around campus for some kind of visiting position, but after 2 days I had nothing. I was about to give up when I had a conversation with the storied health economist, Victor Fuchs, who was the director of the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER office, where Sherwin and I would be working. I gave Victor my best song and dance about the list, heuristics and biases, prospect theory, and the Israeli gods who were about to descend on Stanford. Victor either got intrigued or just took pity on me and offered to put me on his grant for the fall semester. After I arrived at Stanford in July, Victor and I had frequent discussions about my deviant thoughts, and in time he would extend his offer to pay my salary until the following summer. The Thaler family took a leisurely trip across the country in June, hitting national parks along the way. And the drive offered time to let my mind wander about ways to combine psychology and economics. Any topic was fair game for pondering. For instance, suppose I will drive 300 miles today. How fast should I drive? If I drive at 70 miles per hour instead of 60, we will get to our destination 43 minutes sooner, which seems like enough time saved to risk a speeding ticket. But when I have only 30 miles left to go, I will only save 4.3 minutes by driving faster. That doesn't seem worth it. So, should I be gradually slowing down as I get closer to my destination? That can't be right, especially since we are going to get back in the car and drive again tomorrow. Shouldn't I have a uniform policy for the entire trip? Put it on the list. Answer: drive the same speed the whole way. The chance of getting a ticket is proportional to the time you are driving, holding everything else constant. Our trip's final detour was to Eugene, Oregon, to see Baruch Fischoff and Paul Slovic, the psychologists who had originally sparked my interest in these ideas. While the family explored the town, I chatted with Baruch, Paul, and their collaborator, Sarah Lichtenstein. There was also another psychologist visiting their center who, like Fischoff, had studied with Kahneman and Tversky in graduate school, Maya Bar Hillel. All of them would join my informal team of psychology tutors in the coming years. At the end of the summer, the Kahneman and Tversky psychology clan arrived in force. Amos and his wife Barbara were visiting the Stanford Psychology Department. Danny and his future wife, the eminent psychologist Anne Treisman, were to be visiting the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, located just up the hill from NBER. Victor Fuchs arranged the lunch where Amos, Danny, and I first met. I don't remember much about it, except that I was uncharacteristically nervous. I can only trust that the voluble Vic kept the conversation moving. More important, the lunch introduction gave me license to walk up the hill and drop in on Danny. Tversky's office was on campus, too far away to just drop in. He and Tversky were finishing the paper that by now they called Prospect Theory, and I would sometimes wander in while they were working. The center's primitive phone system made it easier to walk up the hill than to call Danny to see if he was around. Sometimes when I stopped by to see Danny, I would find the two of them at work, putting together the final version of Prospect Theory. When they were writing, with Danny at the keyboard, they would talk through each sentence, arguing about virtually every word. Their conversations were an odd mixture of Hebrew and English. An exchange in one language might suddenly switch to the other, with no acknowledgement of the flip. Sometimes the switch to English seemed related to the use of technical terms like loss aversion, for which they had not bothered to invent Hebrew equivalents. But I failed to generate a viable theory for why they would switch in the other direction. It might have helped to know some Hebrew. They spent months polishing the paper. Most academics find getting the initial ideas the most enjoyable part of research, and conducting the actual research is almost as much fun. But few enjoy the writing, and it shows. To call academic writing dull is giving it too much credit. Yet, to many, dull writing is a badge of honor. To write with flair signals that you don't take your work seriously, and readers shouldn't either. There are, of course, exceptions to this generalization. In that era, George Stigler and Tom Schelling come to mind as great writers. Prospect theory is hardly an easy read, but the writing was crystal clear because of their endless editing and Amos's perennial goal of getting it right. Danny and I soon began the habit of taking walks in the hills near the center just to talk. We were equally ignorant and curious about each other's fields, so our conversations offered many learning opportunities. One aspect of these mutual training sessions involved understanding how members of the other profession think and what it takes to convince them of some finding. The use of hypothetical questions offers a good example. All of Kahneman and Tversky's research up to this point relied on simple scenarios, such as, imagine that in addition to everything you now own, you gain $400. Now, consider the choice between a sure loss of $200 or a gamble in which you have a 50% chance to lose $400 and a 50% chance to lose nothing. Most choose to gamble in this situation. As Kahneman delightfully explains in his book, Thinking, Fast and Slow, they would try these thought experiments out on themselves, and if they agreed on an answer, they would provisionally assume that others would answer the same way. Then they would check by asking subjects, typically students. Economists do not put much stock in the answers to hypothetical questions, or survey questions in general, for that matter. Economists say they care more about what people do as opposed to what they say they would do. Kahneman and Tversky were aware of the objections, undoubtedly raised by skeptical economists they had met, but they had little choice. A key prediction of prospect theory is that people react differently to losses than they do to gains. But it is nearly impossible to get permission to run experiments in which subjects might actually lose substantial amounts of money. Even if people were willing to participate, the university committees that review experiments using human subjects might not approve the experiments. In the published version of prospect theory, Amos and Danny included the following defense of their methods. By default, the method of hypothetical choices emerges as the simplest procedure by which a large number of theoretical questions can be investigated. The use of the method relies on the assumption that people often know how they would behave in actual situations of choice, and on the further assumption that the subjects have no special reason to disguise their true preferences. Essentially, they were saying that if their subjects were reasonably accurate in predicting the choices they would actually make in such cases, and their indicated choices were inconsistent with expected utility theory, then that should at least create a presumption of doubt about whether the theory is a good description of behavior. This defense apparently satisfied the journal editor but remained a bugaboo among economists for years. Prospect theory gradually gained acceptance because it proved useful in explaining behavior in a variety of high-stakes settings, where it was possible to observe actual choices, from individual investors to game show contestants. But I don't think any economist would have come up with this theory, even granting them Kahneman and Tversky's psychological insights. An unwillingness to rely on hypothetical questions would have kept them from learning the nuances of behavior that Kahneman and Tversky were able to discern. I found the idea that you could just ask people questions and take their answers seriously to be quite liberating. Up to then, the items on the list were merely thought experiments. It seemed obvious to me that if readers were confronted with one of my hypothetical examples, they would check their intuition and then agree that the behavior existed. This was, of course, naive. And although the survey method was not considered authoritative, it was surely better than a survey of my own intuitions. A few years later, I got a nice lesson on how to do this from the masters themselves. They took my clock, radio, and television shopping example from the list and turned it into shopping for a jacket and a calculator, and then asked people what they would do. Here it is with two different versions indicated by the numbers in parentheses or brackets. Imagine that you are about to purchase a jacket for $125 and a calculator for $15. The calculator salesman informs you that the calculator you wish to buy is on sale for $10 at the other branch of the store, located a 20-minute drive away. Would you make the trip to the other store? Sure enough, real subjects said they would be more willing to take the drive to save $10 on the cheaper item, as I had conjectured. And now there was data to support it. I soon started using this method as well, though sparingly. But Danny and I would rely almost exclusively on the answers to hypothetical questions 7 years later in a project about perceptions of fairness, discussed in Chapter 14. When I was not wandering the hills with Danny, I was hunkered down at NBER with nothing to do but think. Victor Fuchs played the role of guilt-inducing Jewish mother, periodically asking me about my progress. A paradox confronted me. I had what I thought was a big idea, but research proceeds through a series of small steps, and I did not know which small steps would advance the big idea. Big ideas are fine, but I needed to publish papers to stay employed. Looking back, I had what science writer Stephen Johnson calls a slow hunch. A slow hunch is not one of those aha insights when everything becomes clear. Instead, it is more of a vague impression that there is something interesting going on, and an intuition that there could be something important lurking not far away. The problem with a slow hunch is you have no way to know whether it will lead to a dead end. I felt like I had arrived on the shores of a new world with no map, no idea where I should be looking, and no idea whether I would find anything of value. Kahneman and Tversky ran experiments, so it was natural to think that I should be running experiments too. I reached out to the two founders of the then nascent field called experimental economics, Charlie Plott at Caltech and Vernon Smith, then at the University of Arizona. Economists traditionally have used historical data to test hypotheses. Smith and Plott were practitioners of and proselytizers for the idea that one could test economic ideas in the laboratory. I first took a trip down to Tucson to visit Smith. Smith's research agenda was, at least at that time, different from the one I was imagining for myself. When he and Danny shared the Nobel Prize in Economics, many years later, I told a reporter that the difference between their respective research agendas that won them the prize was that Smith was trying to show how well economic theory worked, and Kahneman